Hello, everybody. I'm Larry Rubin, an associate professor in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs, Georgia Institute of Technology, and on behalf of the Center for Strategy, Technology, and Policy here, I want to welcome you to tonight's talk with Professor Goldgeier. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Goldgeier, who exemplifies this crossover between academia and policy, bridging the gap, bringing to bear academic training and analysis to help us understand and work through a lot of these challenging problems that we face today. On a personal note, he's mentored a generation, if not two almost, of scholars and how to bridge this gap between policy and academia, and I'm fortunate to count myself among them. Today, Professor Goldgeier will talk about a really important and incredibly timely subject, how to retool America's alliances to manage the China challenge. And this focuses primarily on transatlantic relations, how to deal with this, something that's been under assault from many directions for a period of recent time. And here at the Nunn School, we've featured many seminars and talks on transatlantic relations, China, emerging technologies, and this continues along those lines. The subject, this subject of tonight's talk comes from a paper of Professor Goldgeier, who we co-authored with Lindsey Ford, who's the current Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for South and Southeast Asia in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy. It's an insightful and accessible report because it not only identifies a challenge, but it proposes a few new ideas for how to think about them and sets a framework to help mitigate these challenges, which will be with us for some period of time. Before I turn it over to Professor Goldgeier, I want to let you know about some housekeeping guidelines. Please write your questions in the Q&A box and at any time, and we'll read them out after the formal part of the presentation, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Now, for the introduction, Professor Goldgeier has urged me to be short on this. He's got a long, extended bio. I want to highlight a few things because it kind of gives some context. We'll do it that way. I'll skip it over. Professor Goldgeier is a professor of international relations and a former dean of the School of International Service at American University. He's also a Robert Bosch Senior Fellow, visiting fellow at the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. He's had a number of visiting senior fellow positions at Council on Foreign Relations, Library of Congress, Hoover, Woodrow Wilson Center, and so forth. He's published extensively on matters of transatlantic relations, a number of books he's authored and co-authored. And I want to also mention that he's served as a director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasian affairs in the National Security Staff in the 1990s. This gives a great amount of context there to kind of help us wade through this stuff. I want to also mention lastly, as I mentioned, is Bridging the Gap. He's a co-director of this initiative that trains scholars and doctoral students to produce policy-oriented, policy-relevant research, and that's theoretically grounded to help kind of tackle some of these challenging problems. I now turn it over to Professor Goldgeier. Thank you very much, and I will end and mute for right now.
Great. Well, thanks to Professor Rubin for including me. Look forward to hearing your questions, and delighted that we've got both students from his class as well as others, hopefully others from Georgia Tech and maybe even beyond, but I'm a huge admirer of all that the Sam Nunn School is doing, so it's great to be with folks tonight. And great to talk about this subject of alliances. It's, we're back to having a president who has been making very clear that he sees America's alliances as enhancing American power and believes that a coalition of democracies is needed to combat the leading authoritarian states, especially China. And with those views, he's put himself squarely back, well, he is squarely back in the mainstream of previous American presidents, for whom the outlier was Donald Trump. Trump viewed allies as undermining the United States. He admired authoritarian rulers, and we now are back to having a president who has a more traditional view. In thinking about this China challenge, which is China is the country that the United States most views as a competitor in the coming years. you can see as you look at the numbers, economic numbers, military spending numbers, you can see why President Biden would view working with our democratic allies as an enhancement of American power. If you look at the 10 largest economies in the world, 7 are the U.S. and its allies. If you take NATO plus Australia, Japan, and South Korea, those countries comprise 60% of global military spending. So you're starting off in a great position to deal with a country that is posing a political, military, economic, technological challenge in the coming years. And so one question facing the Biden administration is how alliances can be shaped to manage the China challenge. And that's the subject that Lindsey Ford and I took on in working on this paper that Professor Rubin mentioned, that we wrote for Brookings that came out in January. And it was wonderful working with her. She's an amazing person, and I'm thrilled that she's at the Pentagon in her new role as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. It is important to note that China is not the Soviet Union of the Cold War. We can get in, if you want, in Q&A to sort of, is this a Cold War? Is that the right term to use? But it is important to recognize, whether we call it a Cold War or not, what's coming, that China and the Soviet Union are not the same. Unlike the Soviet Union, China is integrated into the global economy. That makes a big difference. It has lots of economic leverage over countries. It's got a lot of investments. And, the Soviet Union did not. It separated the Soviet Union and its client states, due to the way the Soviet Union viewed the world. They kept themselves apart from the global economy, which turned out to be a helpful thing when the Soviet Union collapsed. Otherwise, it would have had a profound negative impact on the global economy, but it was separate. China's not separate, it's integrated. The other thing is, during the Cold War, if you look, for example, the NATO allies, they legitimately feared a Soviet invasion. And countries, certainly the NATO allies, don't fear being invaded militarily by China. And really outside of Taiwan, America's allies and partners in the region don't fear this either from China. So unlike the Cold War, where countries were willing to choose sides, there's very little appetite for choosing sides as there was during the Cold War. Countries really, European allies, Australia, others, they don't want to be in a position of choosing sides between the United States and China. And the United States and its allies will need to cooperate with China on a range of global issues, most importantly climate change, but also, as we now know, pandemics, nuclear nonproliferation issues, and others. So just to get our discussion going, I want to lay out sort of 3 key questions as we go forward. These are questions that Lindsey and I posed in our paper. One is, what is the role of NATO when it comes to China? NATO's far away, at least when you look at the European allies. NATO heads of state and government, for the first time in December 2019, so a little more, a year and a quarter ago, stated that China is in fact an issue for NATO to address, but sort of how to think about that is still in its early stages. The NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg tasked an expert group in 2020 to generate ideas on NATO's future. It was Project NATO 2030, what is the name of the project. And that group, in their report, declared, quote, China is best understood as a full-spectrum systemic rival rather than a purely economic player or an only Asia-focused security actor. So full-spectrum systemic rival, that's a big deal. Now, what's NATO actually going to do? It's likely to remain largely a forum for discussion, which could still be very important. From from a political and economic standpoint, to have a forum for conversations about China and how they could impact the United States, Canada, and the 28 European allies. It is true that several of the individual states have done deployments to the Indo-Pacific, but it's not, from a U.S. standpoint, that's not really something that should be terribly important to the United States, because any deployments, that a country like France or the UK does to the Indo-Pacific takes away from what those countries can do in Europe's own neighborhood, where I would argue, and we can talk about this from a U.S. and European standpoint, this is where they're most needed. What the U.S. really needs from Europe, if the U.S. is really going to rebalance its foreign policy toward Asia, toward the Indo-Pacific, as we are now referring to it, it needs Europe to be able to do more in its own neighborhood, in Eastern Europe and Middle East, North Africa. And so that means that European allies, as they build up their own capabilities, hopefully, it'll be to do more in the neighborhood, not to send these forces across to the Indo-Pacific. And so it'll be really interesting. NATO periodically puts out these documents that are called strategic concepts. The last one was done in 2010. So there's now an effort underway to produce a new strategic concept to replace the 2010 version. I mean, think about all the changes in the world that have taken place, not just about the sort of the rise of China, but other issues that have arisen, including a more aggressive Russia. Since 2010, the 2010 strategic concept, we've had the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea. All right, so one question, what's NATO actually doing talking about China as a systemic rival? The second is whether allies have the right operational capabilities to address the China threat. And I think here we really want to think about what the US and its allies in Asia can learn from the European experience. One of the things that Lindsey and I noted as we started the paper was that you have this very interesting dichotomy between the two regions. NATO has had a very diffuse set of missions over the last 2 decades. I mean, when you think about all the things that it's done since the Kosovo War, relief for the Indonesian tsunami, the war in Libya, the mission in Afghanistan, counter-piracy in the Indian Ocean, the counterterrorism in the Mediterranean. I mean, and this past year, relief, airlifting medical assistance to address the pandemic. I mean, a hugely diffuse set of missions. So not a lot of focus. In fact, I mentioned all those missions and didn't mention a key one, which is the deterrence of Russian aggression in the East, in Eastern Europe. So you have this diffuseness of missions with NATO, but it's an organization that has strived for what we call interoperability, the idea of that NATO forces should be able to work together in a crisis or conflict. And, they do training missions together and exercises, and there's all sorts of rules and regulations about the equipment that they have to try to ensure interoperability. You flip that when you go to the Indo-Pacific, the allies the United States has in Asia are very focused on one big threat, and that's the threat from China. But they don't have the same degree of interoperability that the European allies have sought to produce. And in NATO, for example, there's what's called SHAPE, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, the NATO headquarters. I don't think we should expect a replication of something like SHAPE in Asia, but there are other steps allies could take, such as the creation of something like the NATO Defense College in Rome that brings senior military officials together from across Europe and North America. Big issue also in both regions when we think about capabilities will be telecommunications infrastructure There have been a number of reports, for example, on Nato that have argued that increased Chinese investments in technology will undermine interoperability because China would then have the ability to undermine joint efforts. And then just the third question, just coming back to the issue of countries not wanting to choose sides between the United States and China, disagreements on the nature of the threat China poses. I mean, there's all sorts of intra-alliance, intra-regional, and domestic debates, intra-country debates on the nature of the threat China poses. So if there are disagreements on the nature of the threat, how do allies build interest-based coalitions? We're seeing that the Biden administration wants to develop a broad-based recognition that democracies have a shared interest in coming together to manage the general challenge posed by authoritarian states. This is made somewhat harder because you've got countries in both regions, allies, that raise questions about their democratic foundations, Poland and Hungary in Europe, for example, in NATO, as well as Turkey within NATO, the Philippines and Thailand in the Indo-Pacific. And of course, last year we would have talked a great deal about the U.S. commitment to democracy. We do have a White House that is more committed than the last one to democracy, but still there are huge issues, of course, as we know, inside the United States with just democracy itself. That is a real challenge for these alliances and for the Biden commitment to building back better and to utilizing and strengthening democracy at home and abroad. It's going to be incredibly interesting to watch to see how these questions get answered. Alliances will be very important in this, but increasingly so will other forums be as well. There's something called the Quad, which is the US, Japan, Australia, and India. There's been a lot of talk since the Biden team came in. This was something that had been developed in the previous administration, but there's really been a lot of talk since January 20th about the Quad. A number of people, including UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, have proposed a D10. This would broaden the G7, the group of seven leading advanced industrialized democracies. The G7 is the United States, Canada, Japan, Italy, the UK, France, and Germany. The idea would be a D10 that would take the G7 and add Australia, South Korea, and India. So you can see this sort of effort to broaden and the effort with respect to the Quad and the D10 with respect to India will really be something to watch. So the United States under President Biden is renewing its commitment to democracy at home and abroad. And there'll be a lot of interesting developments to watch as the U.S. and its allies determine how best to manage the growing competition from China, as well as the other issues that confront us. And with that, I look forward to questions.
Great, thanks so much for this presentation. We got a number of questions already that have come in, and I want to kind of start off. It's almost continuing, forcing you to talk a bit more. A couple of different things. One, first question is, what are some of your thoughts on the interim national security strategy or strategic guidance that had just come out? And do you think it we can definitely see your mark in the document, or would you like to have seen a little bit more of one thing or another, specifically with regard to alliances or even the push on democracies?
Well, I mean, I think you do see the major themes that President Biden has laid out. First of all, we should praise this team for coming out with this interim guidance. Normally we basically wait a year for an administration to come out with its national security strategy. And the fact that this is called an interim guidance suggests that we will get that national security strategy within the year. But they clearly felt that it was important to put out some kind of interim guidance, given the differences they have with the previous administration, and to create these emphases. And so you do see the emphasis on democracy. I think some of the key things really are, and we're seeing this in a lot of different ways from President Biden, from Secretary of State Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. They are really trying to make this connection between the strength of American democracy and the strength of American foreign policy. They're talking a lot about, as they did during the campaign, about a foreign policy for the middle class, which is really designed to help the American people understand why the foreign policy that the Biden administration is pursuing would be of benefit to them. That's going to be, that's not an easy thing to do. I mean, there are a lot of foreign policy issues that, it's just hard for any of us to see what the connection would be to our lives. So, that'll be something that gets worked out over time. And then I think you see what Secretary of State Blinken described in his confirmation hearings as a mix of confidence and humility, that the United States does want to project confidence as a country that, is the leading power in the world, has a lot to offer, can get things done. I think, in fact, after performing so badly during the pandemic last year, while we saw other countries do much better, especially in terms of fewer deaths per, size of population compared to the United States. As the vaccine rollout ramps up and as we continue to get more and more distribution and more people get these shots in the arms, it's clear the United States right now is doing better than a lot of the countries that we were watching last year thinking, oh my gosh, why are these countries doing so much better than we are? And I think to the extent the Biden administration can do that, it's a reminder that, the United States can actually get things done. And that there is, a power to the system that we have. And they've said, they've talked about this a lot. President Biden has said, and you see this in the guidance, that, it's all good and well to talk about democracy, but if people don't feel like their democratic systems are actually functioning very effectively and can get things done on their behalf, then why are they going to think that democracy is so great? And I think that's why it was so important to him to get this big COVID relief package passed through the Congress, and such an enormous package. But there's also this humility, and you see that in the document. You see the way the document talks about the need to earn back American leadership. That is, they're not. Even though President Biden has said America's back, there's a question, well, do people just follow the United States again and just say, oh, okay, you're back, like you can be the leader again? And this document says that it's something the United States has to earn back. And I think that's an important statement.
No, that's great. And I was always wondering what you think, or how do you think the United States will be able to, there's all this emphasis on saying to the domestic population, here's how foreign policy is relevant again. But when it comes to how do we convince our allies and partners that we are a democracy when they can look at public opinion and see that a lot of people still question the results of the election, how do you think, how would you kind of message that as a public official, potentially in the State Department?
Well, it is, it's unfortunate and it's embarrassing. It's unfortunate because we should have been able last November to celebrate an extraordinary moment in our democracy. More people voted for both candidates for president than ever before. The turnout was remarkable. Biden's vote totals, Trump's vote totals were enormous. in the middle of a pandemic, that people were able to vote. They voted for who they wanted to vote for. And based on all the assessments that we've had, there was no voter fraud. So it should have been this enormous celebration. The big lie that, the election was stolen and there was fraud and all of this was just, it was for the whim and the ego of one individual who couldn't stomach losing an election. And it's really unfortunate that so many people bought it. And so there's no question the administration has work to do. And I think, it's something that our Democratic allies looked at with, a lot of concern. I would say the bigger issue really from our allies is how do they know that policies that President Biden undertakes will last past January 20th, 2025? We don't know who the next president's going to be. But it would be nice if our policies didn't, swing back and forth in huge ways from one president to another, to go from President Obama to President Trump walking away from a number of the commitments that President Obama had made, Iran nuclear deal, Paris Climate Accords, Trans-Pacific Partnership. Biden comes in, rejoins Paris, is talking about the Iran nuclear deal. In 2025, are we going to have a reversal of that? That's not a stable policy. That's not a predictability that's going to lead allies to think that they can rely on the United States. So President Biden has a lot of work to do on that front as well.
Right, great. And probably hard to really come up with a proposal for that as well, too. So let me, we have a number of questions, so I'm going to cut my questions off and hopefully turn it a little to the audience. Combine the first two questions we have here because they're along similar lines, more focused on China. One is from an anonymous person, not anonymous, I hope. What kind of changes would be needed for the existing U.S. force structure in the Indo-Pacific theater to effectively counter increasing threats from PLA? And I guess along those lines, what are some unilateral and multilateral options for dealing with this creeping annexation? These are kind of both along the same lines, if you can potentially answer some of those questions.
Yeah, these are really good questions, and it's really it's just interesting in general to think about, U.S. force structure globally and what we can expect in terms of, if the United States had to fight a war, does it have the forces necessary? And really, we've seen the shift in emphasis that really began during the Trump administration with the National Defense Strategy. In the Trump administration was the first important document that really tried to move us away from a post 9/11 world in which we were basically saying, look, the key capabilities we need are to address the threat from terrorists, to a National Defense Strategy in 2017 saying, either 2017 or 2018, now I forget, but anyway, early in the Trump administration, saying that we now really need to shift our emphasis away from that towards strategic competition and largely talking about China and Russia in that regard. And we shouldn't do China and Russia when we talk about these things. Russia poses a threat. It poses a threat in Eastern Europe, poses a threat in other areas. And it certainly has capabilities to disrupt the United States. And I don't mean to diminish the threat that it poses in any way, but they aren't the same country. And they don't pose the same threat. And China is going to be a much more massive threat to the United States and its allies in the coming years. I think the big question is this unilateral, multilateral one, which is, how much does the United States take on a burden for itself to deal with, and how much does it ask allies to do? In the NATO case, there's been a lot of talk, of course, about are NATO allies spending what they're supposed to on defense? all the allies committed in 2014 that by 2024 they would spend 2% of their GDP on defense. Been a lot of discussion about that, of course, and President Trump very angry about, insufficient spending. But, this is a question for our Asia allies as well, sort of what are they willing to do? The more the United States does, the less incentive they have to do more on their own. I mean, why should you do more if the United States is going to do it for you? I think that's the question, sort of how the United States strikes that balance. And in particular, does it have the wherewithal if there's a crisis, conflict, or even a war over Taiwan, which, is one of the main flashpoints in the region, and, questions about sort of what capabilities can be brought to bear and what role is there for a multilateral coalition to respond to that. And even in the case of Taiwan, while it's not an Article 5 mission because it's outside the Euro-Atlantic region, I think the United States would want to have the political support of European allies if a conflict erupted. So, these are all really important questions, and especially sort of getting the other allies to do more while still maintaining robust U.S. military force.
Great, and I think you might have in advance somewhat answered the next question from Edward. I want to at least call it out about how does a Biden administration balance alliances, burden sharing, and ensuring that foreign policy objectives are achieved. I think you inadvertently answered that or read ahead. I'm not sure, but unless you want to comment further on that, I'll go to the next question.
The only thing I want to say on that is really about the U.S. relationship with its European allies. The United States made a decision 30 years ago that it was going to stay with NATO and continue, and that even though the Warsaw Pact dissolved, which is, had become, NATO had been established to counter the Soviet Union. Soviet Union a few years later established the Warsaw Pact. You had this face-off in Europe between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw Pact disappears. Soviet Union disappears. The question was, well, why NATO staying? And in part, it's because the United States had as its sort of lessons of the 20th century that U.S. needed to stay in charge of European security. And, this lesson came, World War I happened, the United States left Europe. 20 years later, you had World War II. The United States stayed engaged after World War II, kept Western Europe, free and helped it become prosperous. And so at the end of the Cold War, there was this sense, okay, now we finally have this chance now. Soviet Union's disappeared. We can try to really fix the problems of the 20th century in Europe and keep another conflict from erupting that would require us to come in again in a big way, the way we had in the 20th century. And so the decision was made, stick with NATO, because the U.S. is in charge of NATO. It's the dominant country in NATO. And this would be the way to keep the U.S. in charge of European security. All right, we're 30 years later. Does the U.S. really need to stay in charge of European security? I would argue that we need a more balanced partnership. Europe needs to do more. Europe has been talking about strategic autonomy. The United States should encourage it and should encourage the Europeans to be able to take care of more of the problems in its neighborhood, the way President Macron has talked about and the way some German officials have talked about. And that would free the United States up to turn its attention more toward the Indo-Pacific, which is what it needs to be doing. So I think these burden sharing issues are quite real, quite important, but it requires the U.S. to start thinking of itself and its role, especially in Europe, differently.
Great, and want to shift gears slightly, and something that your paper touched on, actually talked about a bit, but this question goes further. Mark Bateman's question on the sharing of concerns about technology advancement and innovation efforts, basically how can the United States coordinate technology advance with its allies, and critical technology information is so difficult, as we know. And as you've served in government, the sharing classified information is a real challenge with anyone outside of in the know, and it's sometimes used to exclude people. So that's it.
Yeah, I mean, there's the sharing the classified information. There's also the technology developments. I mean, we've seen all these, big bitter debates about 5G, about Huawei. Should countries do business? Should our allies do business with Huawei? Should they not? I mean, part of the problem is, you better have something to offer countries. If you're saying don't do business with a Chinese company like Huawei, well, what are you offering? It would help a lot if the United States was, had technology to offer. There are countries that do, and I think we should see more the United States working more with those countries. And then there's the sharing of the classified information. One of the things that we talked about in our paper was expanding Five Eyes. This is the intelligence sharing that goes on among the United States, Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and do you bring in other countries like France or Japan or South Korea into this arrangement? So you're doing broader intelligence sharing among allies. I think that's going to be a big topic of conversation for this administration.
Great. And next question is from Michael CC. What does NATO coordination in countering China's presence in Africa look like, and what kind of tools would NATO use there to counter China's influence on the continent, public diplomacy, arms deals, so forth?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I mean, this is a really interesting issue across the world, right? As China continues to ramp up its own investments and its own presence in countries, what's the proper response? I would say that, I hope we don't end up in a situation like we did during the Cold War, where we felt that we had to be everywhere the Soviet Union was to diminish their influence. I mean, just because China's investing in a place doesn't mean that that's suddenly now a U.S. or a NATO interest. And, we saw this during the Cold War, right? I mean, why were we worried about what took place in Angola? We were worried about the Soviet and Cuban influence. Well, I mean, not every place is an interest. And not every place was an interest in the Cold War just because of the Soviets and Cubans, and not every place is going to be an interest in the coming years just because of China. So partly it really depends. The first step is really, okay, what regions, what countries, what areas are of interest? Why are they of interest? And if there are real Chinese inroads, whether through the Belt and Road Initiative or other means that China has to engage, what's the proper response? And, this sort of gets, I mean, I would say the interesting feature of this question that was asked by Michael is that, NATO is a military alliance, which means really what it does is military activity. But since the end of the Cold War, it has tried to become much more of a political organization. And so it does all sorts of things that really don't have anything to do with or little to do with, or not directly to do with military activity. And that's what the question hinted at, right? What's the role? What's the diplomatic role? What's the development role? And there, I think there's real opportunity to develop NATO-EU collaboration. Many of the NATO countries are members of the European Union. The European Union has different set of competencies. It's not a military organization, has a lot of development and diplomacy capacity. And, even though they're, NATO and the EU are there both in Brussels, there's been much less collaboration between these two institutions than there should be. And I think this question and sort of what the U.S. and its allies are doing in a place like Africa, I think that there's a real role for NATO EU collaboration.
Great, and I want to switch gears back, or switch actually geographic focus back a little bit more. We have a question from Audrey Clark. What role do you see ASEAN in building partnerships between Europe and Southeast Asia?
Yeah, it's great. I mean, and I'm sorry not to have mentioned ASEAN initially in my initial remarks because, I mean, this is such an important group of countries. It's become of much greater importance. The United States, in its own thinking globally, has made ASEAN, much more important actor in region for United States interests. And I do think that European countries also, just because of the economic opportunities, I mean, this, of course, is is one of the great features of the Indo-Pacific region, whether we're talking about East Asia or Southeast Asia or South Asia, is, the tremendous economic opportunities that exist, the development of these economies, the opportunities for investment. And so, it's going to be natural to see the United States, Canada, European partners paying increased attention to ASEAN. I think it'll, really be, interesting to see how this is where I think this question of formal alliances versus informal ad hoc arrangements will really be of greatest interest. I mean, you do have formal relationships between, for example, the United States and the Philippines, the United States and Thailand, two U.S. Allies. But I think that what we're really going to see layered on top of this is much more informal ad hoc arrangements and different kinds of groupings of countries. And I think also, well, I mean, we've already started seeing European countries have their own sets of relationships with countries in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, the UK and France with India, France with Japan. I mean, there's all sorts of interesting groupings and relationships, some of which have nothing to do with the United States, and some of which the United States is engaged in. So I think that that's a real growth area for the United States. And the question of India's role is going to be of increasing importance as well.
Great, and I'm going to take Emma Shumway's question just because we have about 15 minutes left and a lot of questions to look forward to. And her question is, she wants to know what are some of the biggest decisions that caused the United States to spread itself too thin, but more also focused, I think, on what's to be done in the future to avoid, assuming one believes that NATO spread too thin across too many operations, but what's to be done in the future to avoid this problem or challenge?
Yeah, well, I think there are two different issues in that question. One is sort of that NATO and all the different kinds of operations it's done, and then the other is the U.S. Decisions that have spread the U.S. too thin, and especially use of force. And I think Secretary Blinken's recent speech, I mean, he made very clear that the United States is not going to be quick to reach for the military tool to do interventions the way it has in the past several decades, in ways that have spread it too thin, and to really have a more focused foreign policy. The challenge for NATO, so NATO, I mentioned all these different things that it's been doing over the last 20, 25 years. When you think about how it came out of the end of the Cold War and then got involved in the Balkans and and then Afghanistan and the war in Libya, and as I mentioned, tsunami, counter-piracy, counter-terrorism, I mean, all these different things. Part of the challenge is there's no other institution in the world that can do what NATO does. So if you're looking for a multilateral global military institution, you're sort of stuck with NATO. Who else is going to do these major airlifting of supplies efforts? When the international community was concerned about the Libyan government's move on the population of Benghazi and the potential for genocide in Benghazi, the UN Security Council authorized NATO to do that operation. It wasn't like there were other institutions out there that could do it. So I think that's a real challenge for NATO. It's hard for it not to get spread too thin because something happens in the world and you want an institution, you're looking around for an institution, and it's like, oh, well, we got NATO. And I think that the strategic concept, that this process will really try to focus, to do that kind of focusing for NATO to really try to bring it back to having a clear central purpose.
Great, and here's a question from Bob Bell. China worked with the P5 to achieve the nuclear test ban, chemical weapons treaty, and JCPOA, as well as an NPT 5 decades ago. Can you envision any other, quote, arms control or non-proliferation regimes where China might be willing to engage? New START 2.0, globalize it, INF, global open skies, etc.
Well, I would rather hear Bob Bell talk about this than me, but he is the expert. But I think there's going to be a lot of interest from this administration on INF. But I back up just 1 second just to say, this is where this relationship with China is so interesting because, it's not just about competition. It is also about finding ways to cooperate. And of course, during the Cold War, we both competed with the Soviet Union and found avenues for cooperation, especially on arms control. And China will be important for a variety of issues. I think the thing to watch for will be the intermediate range nuclear weapons issue, the INF issue, because, the United States, Joe Biden, one of the first things he did was to get back into New START. To extend New START. New START was expiring in February, and he had to make the commitment about whether or not to extend, and agreed to extend for the full 5 years. There were people who were arguing maybe we shouldn't. The previous administration on the strategic arms control had talked about the need to bring China in on strategic arms control, which from my standpoint never really made any sense because the U.S. and Russia are up here and China's down here on strategic arms. China has a big way to go before it hits any kind of similar ceiling. But on the intermediate range nuclear forces issue, treaty was signed by Reagan and Gorbachev in 1987, eliminated a whole class of nuclear weapons, the intermediate range weapons. And Russians were in violation of the treaty. The Obama administration hadn't really addressed sufficiently the Russian violations. And the Trump administration, rather than try to renegotiate, just said, you violated, we're out, we're done, we're gone. And really can't, unlike New START at the strategic level, INF, you really can't just walk back into it with the Russians because you do have this issue of Chinese intermediate range nuclear forces. And I think we are going to need to see a multilateral regime. And I think that this will be an interesting issue for the United States and Russia to really figure out a way to bring China into those talks and hopefully to rebuild a regime around, limiting intermediate range nuclear forces.
Great. And I'm going to wrap up with a couple questions that go back to domestic, but I want to jump into at first Adam Stolberg's question here. What steps do you recommend the U.S. take to orchestrate convergence among transatlantic partners regarding the containing of PRC influence? And what metrics can be used, you think, to distinguish constructive economic or tech investment from dangerously risky steps towards strategic dependency?
Could you repeat the first part of the question again? This is about...
Yeah, what steps do you recommend the U.S. take to orchestrate convergence among transatlantic partners regarding containing PRC influence?
Containing
and then
PRC.
The other one's about metrics to get kind of constructive engagement.
Yeah. Well, the first step was really to start talking about China. I mean, that's what you had with the December 2019 declaration. And I think the way in which the NATO 2030, the reflections group, the experts group that Stoltenberg had laid out, that Stoltenberg had charged with coming out with a report, the report released in November, really provides a lot of food for thought for thinking about China as they put it, as this systemic rival. But as Adam's question indicates, I mean, convergence will be really hard, in part because of the differences within countries on what threat China poses and how best to deal with it. And within Europe, I mean, I'll just cite a few things. Just, this is sort of may come across as a little rambling, but I think just sort of things to think about. One will be sort of where Germany goes on this question of China. Even within Chancellor Merkel's own party, she's been criticized for being too soft on China and too accommodating to German business interests. But, worth noting, I mean, people thought she wouldn't be tough on the sanctions on Russia because of German business interests. So you got to give, kudos to her for sticking with the sanctions on Russia. But you do have these charges being too soft. And, we don't know. I mean, we've gotten used to her being the chancellor for so long with the elections in September. We should be seeing a new chancellor of Germany and, maybe a different coalition. And so, that'll be a major country to watch. Meanwhile, there you have Italy, joining Belt and Road. And so, what does that mean? And you also had the phenomenon of countries in Eastern Europe developing a grouping to negotiate with China and work with China on a number of issues. The other thing I'll say on this, just sort of getting back to Adam's question about possibilities for convergence, public opinion polling has been really interesting on this, and Lindsey and I put this in the paper where you see sort of major allies and public attitudes towards China. I mean, it's really amazing when you look, for the most part, at the U.S. and its allies. The attitudes towards China have gone from, pretty positive 10, 15 years ago to really, really negative. I mean, it's a rapid shift, which provides opportunities for creating some convergence. But you do have two important outliers in Europe, and that's Poland and Italy, which have seen a favorable attitudes towards China. And, these are two important allies for NATO. So I think it'll be really interesting to see. And the only last thing I'll say on that, I know we're running out of time, and I know you have more questions, but we're getting used in DC. We're getting used to the idea that this is a bipartisan issue now, everybody wants to be tough on China. And I do worry a little bit that we'll sort of be doing too much of getting tough on China, and we'll put everything in the context that the way to get legislation passed, for example, on infrastructure or 5G or whatever, technology investments, whatever it is, will be to say, well, we got to do this because we need to be tough on China. We need to, it's about the strategic competition with China. We can't make everything about China.
No, that's it's a good note for things to think about too, the way so much was framed. And there was actually a great follow-up question, but I'm going to combine it with two others because we're running out of time. And one was actually how, given Poland and Italy that you mentioned in the paper, this is from Brianna Clay, how can the EU and NATO balance between BRI influence and tougher policy stance? But let me hold that question kind of combine one from Joe Bankoff. For what role do you see unilateral United States engagement on issues of educational exchange? With another one, I think it's relevant from Emily Savanovic. How can we avoid the isolationism that has occurred in the last administration from happening again and taking the U.S. backwards? It's something that we can control. And I think that's probably a good way to, however you want to answer these questions, probably a good way to end as we come close to the end of time.
Okay, great. Well, and I'm so thrilled that so many of your colleagues at the Nunn School were able to join us. I'm truly honored. I really am that so many wonderful colleagues and both your former fearless leader, Mr. Bankoff, and your current fearless leader, Professor Stolberg, have both joined. So I'm going to focus, because we only have a minute or two left, just on the isolationism question, because I think this is the root of this issue of a foreign policy for the middle class. The reason that was developed by the people who are now staffing the Biden administration is because they looked at 2017 and thought, oh my goodness, this is a group of people that cares about international engagement, believes engagement is important for the United States, serves U.S. interests. But the American people clearly don't see it that way because they just elected Donald Trump. And so I think they went about this whole project of a foreign policy for the middle class with this idea in mind. Well, if people are going to believe in engagement the way this, group of elites does, then you're going to have to be able to show people. And it's not just telling people you should care about American engagement. It's about demonstrating to them, this particular kind of engagement does benefit me personally. And that's going to be hard. That's really hard. What do you do about communities that have seen job losses? I mean, there's a reason why those people aren't happy with, for example, free trade agreements. Discussions about cutting the defense budget. There are a lot of communities that depend heavily on the defense budget, for economic development in their communities. There are also a lot of issues where it's kind of hard to make the connection. I mean, it may be important for the Biden administration to speak out on behalf of democracy in Myanmar in the face of a military coup. But that's going to be a tough issue to tie to, people's daily lives here in the United States. So I think, they've started talking about this issue. They had built some discussion of it prior to coming into office. But I think it'll be really interesting to see how they develop it, and then just maybe end on this note about educational exchange, which, I'm such a firm believer in. It's so important for our universities. We want to be able to continue to bring students from all over the world to the United States and to still show that the United States is a place where people want to come, and that our universities are our, one of our most important and, top industries, top sectors, that they are as good, if not better, than anywhere else. And so but it's more competitive now, and so we want to continue to attract the best and the brightest from other parts of the world, and we need to send our own students out, of course, to places like China and Russia, so that they become better able to understand these different cultures and different peoples, and that'll produce better policy over time. I think any of us in education who've seen educational exchange believe that.
Well, thank you so much. I couldn't have thought of a better way to end this. This incredibly interesting and engaging, and I know I've certainly learned a ton, and I want to give you a big Nunn School, SysStep, Georgia Tech thank you. Everything else and we look forward to further engagements as we can, and hopefully something in person at some point in the future.
I look forward to that. Stay safe, everyone, and I'll very much look forward to coming down to Atlanta at some point.
Great, thanks so much. Bye.